Many people only know us for our complete firearms, but in many ways where we got started was the aftermarket part game. In this episode, we discuss the history, how we kind of got started, the evolution of where we are now, and where we think it may be going in the future. This is the No Excuse to Miss podcast. Welcome to the No Excuse to Miss podcast. I'm your host, Scott Volquartsen. This week, we're going to change it up a little bit and dive into something that a lot of people may or may not know about what we do, and that's the manufacturing of internal components and the aftermarket parts for a wide variety of firearms. And I am here with Chad Wittrock, our Director of Marketing, to kind of go over the evolution of how we got into the aftermarket parts and what we do with ours that we think kind of sets us aside or sets us apart from the other industry members. It's something that comes up quite a bit on social media in questions. So we thought we'd take this chance just to kind of go over, a little bit of the history of the parts and where it's evolved to now. So how you doing today, Chad?
Really well. I'm excited to get into this because, like you mentioned, we get a lot of questions about aftermarket parts, internal components, processes, the differences. So, kind of like you touched on, this may be something not a lot of people know about. So you were telling me kind of a fascinating story before we jumped on here about how the whole aftermarket parts line kind of started. Love to ask you about that or have you share that as well.
So, it's interesting. Our firearms typically get a lot of the recognition, and that's what a lot of people know us for, and it's not even the aftermarket parts. But if we go back into like the late 1980s, early 1990s, the majority of what our business was, and when I say our business, I'm referring to what Dad was doing basically.
Sure, yep.
He was doing a lot of, I'll call it gunsmithing work or trigger action jobs on the Ruger, at that time, the Ruger Mark I and the Ruger Mark II, as well as the Ruger 1022. As we've kind of talked about before, he was a one-man shop that wasn't necessarily interested in bringing in a lot of outside help.
Yep. But
his work volume had started to overwhelm him, and he didn't have the time to put his finishing touches on every single one of these action jobs that was coming in.
Oh, gotcha. He was kind of falling behind.
Yeah, he was falling behind, and I want to say I was 13, 14 years old, so I wasn't necessarily at that place that I could help. And the thing is, when you modify internal components, obviously there's a safety aspect to that, but it requires a skill that's developed over time.
Not something you could just jump into.
Correct. And if I'm being honest, at the age of 13 or 14, I did not have that ability, or I didn't have that attention to detail that it took to do that type of work.
Sure.
And the other downside is when you modified factory parts, a lot of times you would go through that outside hardness that was, whether the part be case hardened or whatever it might be. So even if you had a phenomenal trigger pull after 4,000 or 5,000 rounds, maybe it took 10,000 rounds, that trigger pull would start to become almost mushy.
Oh, okay, because you wore through the case.
You wore through that case hardening, and after you used a stone or polish through that, you did not have that same level of hardness that it came from the factory. So many times, Dad would have to go back and rework that. So that created more work, and that was all warranty work. So
yeah, so there's not.
It was kind of a vicious cycle.
Yep.
So I remember being in the shop one day, and Dad just looked and he said, "I'm going to fix this issue of trying to do all these action jobs." And at the time, I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he said, give me a couple months and we're going to have a complete kit that anybody, even you, he was referring to me, can drop into these, and you're going to achieve that same trigger pull as if it was a custom one-off job that he was doing.
Sure.
And that kind of began, slowly after that, we started coming out with the target hammer for the Ruger 1022, and then our accurizing kit for the Ruger Mark II. And it's kind of funny to even think about how those parts were manufactured back then, because the majority of them were all cast. They would be sent into us. We would have to, because they couldn't hold the tolerances that we were looking for, obviously, we would have to go back and drill the pivot pin holes out.
All manually?
All manually on the hammers, the sears. all the internal parts, even like our extended magazine releases back in the day. And then what would happen is we would take those. It was kind of a long drawn out process. So prior to us being able to drill them, we had to take them through a heat treat process that would actually anneal and soften the parts so we could drill them out.
Right.
We would drill them. We would then go back and harden them. And then we would surface grind the notch, which was the critical area on them.
Oh, wow.
And then through the heat treating process, you'd end up with heat scale on it, discoloration. And from a functional standpoint, that may or may not have hurt anything. From an appearance, when a guy got a new part, it was not going to work. So then we had to develop our own polishing techniques. And that's where it became much trickier, because some of the polishing stuff that we developed back then, we still use today, such as like centrifugal disc machines to take the major heat scale off. But then the advance in technology has now allowed us to, besides the parts being manufactured completely different now, where we use like a wire EDM process on many of them, which eliminates so much of what we had to do and actually provides a better part than what we had 30 years ago.
Takes a lot of those smaller processes out of the equation.
Yes, it does. Yeah. But like on certain parts, like let's say our target sear that we use for the Ruger MK series pistols, that has gone through a transition over the years. We've tried, titanium nitride coating. We've tried different polishing techniques. And now we actually use a trademarked process called micro machining technology, which is done by a third party. But it actually allows us to put a finish on the sear like we haven't had in the 30 years we've been manufacturing them.
Oh, wow.
And it's one of those things, many times people will say, where does all the cost come from on the production of our parts?
Yeah, why are they so expensive?
Yes, why are they so expensive? Or, why does company A do it for this? And a lot of it is, one, the wire EDM machining it's phenomenal what it can do holding tolerances. Mm-hmm. It's not the fastest process out there, but to us, it gives us the best part.
Right, which is the most important thing to us. Yeah.
Yes, and certain things like that finish I just referenced, that MMP finish, it's very expensive to do. There's fixtures that have to be made. But after we've tested that and we see what it'll do, it's really, we're not wired to say, well, that's too expensive.
Well, I was just going to say, it goes back to our whole mission of, if there's a better way and we know about it, we're probably going to do that.
Yes. And, it's interesting. A lot of times in the questions we will get, and probably more so even like on the 1022 parts, because it seems like there's a lot of other aftermarket components available for that. Mm-hmm. Maybe more so than the trigger components for the Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV.
Sure.
We'll get, how do our parts compare to company X? Mm-hmm. And I'm being completely honest when I say this, is we don't spend a lot of time comparing our parts to other manufacturers. To us, that's energy wasted.
Right.
What we would prefer to do is keep doing our research, keep doing our development, keep trying new processes, staying on top of technology. And then one of the most important things is we listen to not only the competition shooters that put 50, 60,000 rounds down range a year, but just to the average backyard plinker. I don't think people fully understand how much we take into account when we get an email that says, can you do this? Or would it be easier if we could do this?
Right.
Or have you ever thought about making this? Some of our best products and ideas have come from a customer suggestion. It may not be that exact thing, but it may spur us or get our minds working and be like, hey, we could do we can't do that, but we could do something very similar.
Yeah. That brings up kind of a really good, I guess, what goes into the R&D side on our parts line, would you say? How do you take it from, okay, this is an idea. Is there enough validity there to actually move forward with pushing this product to market?
Probably the number one factor is how many, and we never have concrete numbers, but roughly how many of that factory model firearm are out there. And then secondly, how many different versions or iterations of that firearm had there been?
Trying to take all the variables out of the
correct, because there's certain, if you look at I'll just start with the 1022. It's been around for almost 60 years or maybe north of 60 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's gone through a lot of different versions. Even such little things as the original 1022s, I believe they have a prefix. It's interesting because now they've gone back to certain prefixes, but some of the ones that were built back in the 60s, they would actually have an additional rail on the inside of where the bolt ran. So when we started producing our machine bolt, guys that were putting them into the oldest 1022s were having problems.
It wasn't built for that.
It wasn't built for that. And we've encountered that in multiple firearms where all of a sudden in this production year, they've decided to make a change.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have a much better relationship with many of the major manufacturers where we're able to stay a little more up to date when certain changes are made.
Right.
But especially if you look back to when Dad was first getting started into the, aftermarket parts, there wasn't the internet. He was just a small one-person shop in the middle of Iowa. Companies weren't interested with trading trading specs or changes with him. They didn't even know who he was, for lack of a better way to look at it.
Right.
So that aspect, social media, YouTube, all the different things that we can look up now, the way we've grown and the relationship we've built with different major manufacturers all helps us develop more parts.
Right. And then that kind of helps test that validity you mentioned, if it's going to be something we really want to take all the way through the process and actually release.
Correct. And many times our goal when we come out with an aftermarket part is it's got to solve a problem that somebody's having.
We won't just build one to build one.
Correct. Yeah. If it's not solving a problem, even if it may enhance something just cosmetically, or many times we see aftermarket parts, it's a change for the sake of change.
Right.
But it's not addressing an issue that customers may have been having.
Oh, that's a great point.
One of the biggest examples is our Exact Edge extractor that we've been manufacturing for several years, many years now, for the 1022 and the Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV, it does an excellent job of eliminating stovepipes.
Mm-hmm.
And even that simple part has evolved over the 10 plus years we've been manufacturing it.
Yeah.
But the nice thing about it is we're then able to take that research, that technology, that experience, and apply it to other extractors that we'll start to see a trend of, can you make an extractor for this?
Yeah.
And then you start seeing that trend where those emails keep coming in where I love this pistol or I love this rifle, but the only thing it needs is a new extractor.
Yep.
And with using that same technology that we've developed on our original extractor, it's pretty easy then to branch out and make one for the Model 41, the Remington 870 shotgun, the 597 rifles from Remington.
Oh, so Smith & Wesson models too, correct?
Yes. Yeah, the 1522s, like I said, the Model 41. So you draw on a lot of that experience over the years
mm-hmm.
to be able to, so the extractors that we make now for new models, obviously the testing and research is a lot less.
Yeah, because you kind of have that foundation in place.
Correct.
Yep. And going back, even touching on what you were touching on previously with the 1022, how would you say the parts market has evolved, as far as the rimfire world has, I guess, expanded since your dad was starting? Because there's much more manufacturers offering parts lines than there was initially, correct?
It's exciting to see because when Dad started doing it, it was him and Jim Clark were the only guys that were doing anything to the 1022, as far as I can remember. Somebody out there may correct me. But as far as I remember, they kind of started it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's really grown from there. And the cool thing to us is to see these because so few people were interested in modifying it back when Dad and Jim started.
Mm-hmm.
Two separate companies, but they kind of had a very similar thought process on how to improve the 1022.
Right.
And now you look around at all the different, modifications that are out there, whether it be barrels, chassis, stocks, trigger components, all these different things.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times we will see one from another manufacturer like, damn, I wish we would have thought of that. But it's one of those things that we've always made it our mission we don't want to copy somebody else's innovation.
Sure.
If we can't improve upon it with a slightly different design, we'll just, in the past, we bought parts from other companies that we're like, that's a really good part.
That's as good as it's probably going to get. Yeah.
Will you sell it to us? We'll help you market it or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But it's crazy to think how that market has blown up.
Right. Would you say was there a time where you felt this is really the curve? When do you feel like things really kind of turned in that direction, or that tide turned into that customization kind of world, or, modifying?
I would say probably the mid to late 90s, there was a big change in that. And a lot of that came from the Sportsman's Team Challenge that was around at the time. Well, it's still around now.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of took the competition shooters by storm. It was the one that was held. It was being broadcast on ESPN as part of the Great Outdoor Games.
Oh, right. Yep.
So, and a lot of the shooters were using 1022s at that time. Obviously heavily customized. But to me, that's kind of where much of this gained momentum as far as, the aftermarket heavy barrel for accuracy, a better trigger. Because it was a competition that combined accuracy with speed.
Right. Yep.
And then the Ruger what's now the Rimfire Challenge was originally the Ruger Rimfire back in, I believe, 2009, 2010, in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of brought a whole new subset of parts available for the 1022, because that became, how light can you go?
Yeah.
And
because less weight equaled more speed. That was basically
that was the thought process.
Yeah, that was the thought process right off the bat.
And it still is prevalent. Most people still believe that. There's guys that have argued that and shoot heavier stuff. And Colby Pavlock, who shoots for us, is one of those guys. Yeah. But that's where it became, okay, we can sacrifice a little bit of accuracy, but it's got to run at or near 100%, because stovepipes will cost you a match.
Yeah, so
a light hit will cost you a match.
Yeah, which you bring up a great point. A lot of the innovation behind these parts and what we always strive for was reliability and function.
Yes. And the other thing that Dad would always talk about, and it's still our mantra today, is, you worry about accuracy, you worry about performance, you worry about functioning. And even though he was kind of one of the first ones that started doing some wild designs from the aesthetic side, that was all done after those first three.
It wasn't the first.
No, it was like a byproduct.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Of, okay, we got that part figured out. Now how can we make it look different or look cool?
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, it's been kind of humbling to hear how many, talk to a lot of different guys that have started companies in or around the 1022 market that point to like things that Dad did as it kind of inspired them that they wanted to get into that.
Well, that's great to hear.
Because he was one of the first ones that started incorporating different colors into stock designs, barrel designs. And I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before. He had at the SHOT Show, he was called the King of Weird because it looked completely different than what everybody else at the time was doing.
I remember you mentioning that. Yeah. That was kind of his nickname, or
I don't think he likes it as a nickname. I think as he's gotten older, he's learned to take it as more of a compliment.
There we go. Oh, that's awesome. I'm gonna put you on the spot. So if someone's looking at aftermarket parts, maybe they have a 1022, and obviously budgets vary and things, where would you, maybe if you're on a limited budget, let's start there. If you're on maybe more of a limited budget and you have 1022, where would you start? If you were looking to say, I want to make some upgrades.
So, and I know there's differing opinions out there from mine, but I always say start with the trigger. And the reason for that is, once again, my opinion, if you can put a $300, $400, $500 barrel on a rifle, but if you are fighting a 5, 6, 8 pound trigger pull, you're never really going to fully realize the capability of the barrel.
Right. That makes sense.
So if you're on a limited budget, I always say start with what has probably been our most popular part over the last 30 years, and that's our 1022 target hammer.
Nice.
It'll get you down to about a 2.5 pound trigger pull. It's relatively inexpensive. It comes with springs, and it will, it's a drastic improvement over many of the factory trigger pulls.
Yeah, just by replacing the hammer.
Just by replacing that. And like I always like to tell people, start there, and then you can kind of see the capabilities of the barrel. And then you can determine how far you want to go on that barrel. Do you want to go with a heavy barrel, a lightweight barrel? Do you want to replace the stock? But to me, I start with the target hammer, and many times I start with the extractor too, just because the extractor is not going to help you with accuracy or anything like that. But if you're fighting stovepipes, if you're fighting ejection issues, it takes all the fun out of it.
Yep. Nothing ruins a day at the range faster than having feed problems. Yep.
And as I'm thinking about it, it's interesting to see how things have evolved, even like to the point on our barrels, and the rimfire barrel market as a whole of what people are doing. This is kind of off topic, but 20 years ago, nobody would have dreamed of a competition of shooting a 22 rimfire at 220 yards or the various NRL distances.
Yep.
There's companies out there like Voodoo that are pushing the envelope much further than that.
Right. And even with the chassis and stocks that people are coming out with is just incredible.
And I think more and more people are seeing the value of practicing with a 22 at 200 or 250 yards, whatever it might be, and then being able to take those skills learned and transfer them over to their larger centerfires.
Yeah.
But do it at a fraction of the cost. We've seen it at different events that we do. You can, in a few minutes with the right instruction, you can have people that have never fired a rifle before, hitting steel at 200 yards.
Yep. And when they hear that plink like echo back across the range, it's a pretty big deal.
Yes, it is. And that's what's going to bring them back.
Yep.
There's minimal recoil. It's not real loud, and they get that chance to, be successful at what they're trying to do.
Yep. That taste of success is definitely the addictive part.
Yeah, and and that's kind of what drives us. We're even working on some new barrels right now, specifically designed towards some of the longer range shooting. We're still in the testing phase. Yep. Because there's obviously a lot that goes into that, from the accuracy standpoint, longevity, durability, all the different 22 rounds that are available. But to us, that's what's fun, is constantly pushing the envelope of what's possible.
Yeah, that touches on kind of what you mentioned earlier, is just because we have barrels out now for the 1022, that doesn't mean we've walked away from looking at what's next.
Correct. And that doesn't even mean that the barrels that we produce now don't look anything, but internally, they're not anything close to what we had 30 years ago.
They evolve.
Technology's evolved. We now laser harden all of our breeches, which it's a pretty neat process because it doesn't affect the chamber in any way. And it can be done at a level that can be controlled much more than prior, like flame induction hardening type processes. Everything's becoming more exact, and it's fun to be able to kind of combine that with some of the old school technology that we still use when it comes to like polishing our parts.
Definitely. And just for people that don't know, what does the laser hardening the breech, what does that do for the shooter?
Basically, a lot of times if you look at certain 1022 barrels or any rimfire barrels, you can see some deformation on the breech face. And that comes from either not having it hardened, so if it's not hardened, you'll see that. So this eliminates that. Secondly, the ones that are hardened many times have been done through just like a flame induction hardening process, which they're just looking to get that breech hard. But there's no way to control the depth or the hardness on that.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of an imperfect science where the laser hardening takes or eliminates that aspect of it.
Well, that's fascinating because I knew there was a lot of really good benefits, and we have talked to people about laser hardening the breeches, but I thought it'd be good to kind of touch on, the bigger picture as to why and what's the benefit to that. Switching gears just a little bit, I wanted to touch on, a couple other popular parts, which would probably be our competition bolt for the 1022 and then the competition bolt for the Ruger Mark series. What's kind of the history or the evolution behind those two key parts?
There's really two different separate things that went on with those. I'll start with the pistol bolt. That started, we had our aftermarket firing pin and extractor for that bolt. And then we were making a charging handle that would go on the back of a factory bolt.
Okay.
And it never really worked or felt right the way we wanted.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, we're like, what if we machine that bolt handle integral to the back of the bolt? And we started doing that, and instantly people were drawn to it. It makes it easier to cycle the bolt. It eliminates pinching your fingers. It's much easier for young kids or those that don't have the same strength in their hand as certain people
mm-hmm.
to be able to cycle the bolt. And, like anything else we do, that evolved. Yep. Next thing you know, we started playing around with different finishes that would improve it. And we settled on a DLC coating that we use,
mm-hmm.
which is really good when you're considering a rimfire, because one of the downsides of rimfire is it's very dirty many times.
Yep.
And a lot of times the solution to that is more oil, more lubricant. Well, and that becomes more residue stuck to your bolt, to the inside of your receiver, and eventually causes problems.
Yep.
And with how popular suppressors have gotten and the blowback that's involved there, that just further compounds the issue.
Yep.
So we're like, what can we do that you don't need to oil the heck out of your bolt? And this finish is what it was. So many times we recommend a drop or two on the bolt, rack the bolt a couple times and you're good to go.
That's it. No need to coat the whole bolt with oil.
Correct. Yep. Because it has this finish. And to the naked eye, a lot of times it looks like it is loaded in oil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's got
and
awesome...
then you go up and you put your finger on it. You're like, oh, that's dry.
Yeah, the sheen on it is amazing.
So that's kind of the pistol bolt. The rifle bolt was one that we were trying to find a way to optimize accuracy out of a semi-auto rifle.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, there was companies out there that would set the head spacing on the bolt. They would do some different work to the bolt. They would pin the firing pin down so it didn't move up and down, which a lot of people don't even understand that a little bit of that movement creates an issue when that firing, because the way it's designed. So what we did is we started with a round titanium firing pin.
Mm-hmm.
And what it allowed us to do was two things. One, it eliminated that up and down movement. Two, we were able to shorten the distance that the firing pin traveled, which is how we got away with titanium, because we always found when we used titanium on a replacement 1022 firing pin,
mm-hmm.
it would lose its energy by the time it got to the rim of the cartridge.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So by shortening that distance up, we took care of that issue. And, when we're looking at that, probably a little bit faster lock time, and it's dealing in minutia, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
But we were looking to produce the very best 1022 style rifle or bolt that we could make.
Yep.
And once we discovered the DLC coating, that also, we're like, obviously we need to apply that to this bolt as well for the exact same reasons.
Yep.
And that particular finish on both of those bolts is probably one of the biggest improvements we've made over the last few years. And once again, it's expensive.
Yep.
And it's one of those things that there's a lot of companies that do this finish, but not all of those companies are the same.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It takes proper prep work to be able to do it and give us the cosmetic appearance and the physical properties that we're looking for.
So it's a pretty involved process overall.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. The one other thing I wanted to touch on, sticking kind of with the 1022s, is we can go all the way into, we do aftermarket receivers also. Was that kind of the next step? When would you say those came into play?
Those would have been 1999. And I only know that from when we started manufacturing our own complete rifles.
Mm-hmm.
The aftermarket receivers were next because we had a lot of customers up to that point that had already bought stocks from us, already bought barrels from us. They've already had trigger jobs done or different work done, or their bolt, as I mentioned before, they've already had the head spacing set. They didn't need to buy an entire rifle, but they were looking for an improved receiver.
So that was next.
That was next. So that's where the stainless steel and our aluminum aftermarket receivers came from.
Oh, nice.
Speaking of the aftermarket and just the way things have evolved, that's another thing that I just thought of with our stocks.
Mm-hmm.
That was something that for many years we purchased aftermarket, and we were never really able to control the tolerances the way we wanted to.
As far as producing like a wood or laminate wood
Correct,
stock?
a laminated wood stock. And that's when we decided, let's try doing it ourselves. And, we struggled just like anybody else when you take on a new project. And that process has improved. And one of the biggest things that we've noticed that we feel gives us an advantage on those is many stocks, the outside is profiled.
So you get the look first.
So you get the look first, and then they go back and do the inletting as a secondary operation.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've ever seen a stock prior to the outside being turned, it is a massive chunk of laminated wood that is extremely rigid. So, and I'll give this credit to Jared, who heads up that stock division. He said, what if we machine the inletting first, where when the stock's at its most rigid, and then we go turn it from there?
Because your tolerances are going to be...
Correct, because you can get away with a little more on the tolerance of the outside because you're going to have to go back and sand and finish it and different things that way.
Which he does do, correct?
Correct. Where that inletting is what you want to control the tolerances on the most.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we start doing that. And it was a complete game changer in how our stocks would fit to our actions or any 1022 receiver or aftermarket action.
It was just that much more snug.
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome.
And not only snug, but that much more consistent.
Oh, that's a better way to put it.
From one to the next.
Yep.
Which is, as I say that, from one to the next, the other thing that we're able to do, the way we manufacture our parts, and I'm kind of all over the place, so I apologize, but 30 years ago when we had parts cast, one of the downfalls was if we wanted to make a change, it was a process. The tooling had to be changed. Not everybody, now everything's done through SolidWorks or some other form of 3D modeling.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, a lot of it was done on napkins that Dad had at the kitchen table. So in order to get those changes made, though, it was a time-consuming process. It may take 12 to 16 weeks for us to get a sample part to try.
Yeah, this wasn't just, we're going to try something on Tuesday and we're going to adjust on Friday.
Correct. Yeah. Where once we start doing everything in-house with the wire EDM and CNC machining, we're able to take a new product, I shouldn't say a new product. We should be able to take an existing product that we want to try a change on. And many times in 2 to 3 days, we can have that part completely finished, heat treated, everything ready to go and test.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes it easier when we do need to make a change.
Yeah. Or like I said, we always kind of strive for that next step.
Correct. It makes it, and you bring up a great point. It makes it easier to test that next evolution of what we think might be better. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it isn't.
Right.
Sometimes what you see on the computer screen or what engineering tells you should work doesn't translate or doesn't transfer to the range.
Well, I think that's a great point. And we touched on this right before we started recording was, sometimes things look great on paper, or I think you even kind of said the science says this, but we still rely heavily, and probably, I would say heavily, on the feedback of our shooters and customers.
Feedback, yes. And, and that's the one benefit of sponsoring shooters. Yes, you want them out there, you want them to win, you want them to represent your brand. But the third part of that is not many people put as many rounds down range in the same condition as what they will. Mm-hmm. And we've had a few shooters, and I'm not going to call them out by name, that they also don't clean their firearms. So, but to some degree, that actually is what we want.
Mm-hmm. Just push
that lets us push and find out where the weaknesses are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of a trial by fire approach, and then gives us the information we need to innovate further if needed.
And I've said this before, that when we go to matches, I'm probably one of the most nervous people there, more so than the competitors, because I see a lot of our gear on the line.
Mm-hmm.
And anytime I see somebody using one of our firearms, in the back of your head, you're always, I don't know the best way to say this, but you're always hoping, please run 100%.
Yeah.
And you do everything to make sure that they will.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still that moment when you're up there watching them that you're like, let's make sure this works the way we expect it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That I can imagine.
So, and that is good and bad, because we have people that'll come up and say, hey, I switched to this bolt, or I switched to this, and I've never had my gun run like this.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I've also been on the other end where things still happen.
Yep.
And
it's still rimfire shooting.
It's still rimfire shooting, and it's still a mechanical device.
And things happen.
And things happen, and that's where we take them. And because we're so competitive and we want to make sure this doesn't happen, those are the moments that we actually learn from the most.
Yeah.
Is, hey, let me take that, here's a replacement for now. Let me take that one back to the shop. We'll go through it. We'll figure out what failed. We'll figure out what happened.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to see this again.
Yeah, it won't repeat. Yep. So kind of in closing here, as we start to wrap this up, where do you see aftermarket parts, especially for rimfire, maybe going in the next 5-10 years? Do you feel like there's a curve that it's kind of following, or a trajectory? What are your thoughts?
I feel like even though many people may think that the market has sort of been maxed out on what can be done,
and that maybe complete firearms are going to be where it's at,
but I still think, we've thought that for 15 or 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think we underestimate the number of people that own 22s.
Sure.
So from the aftermarket standpoint, I think there's still a lot of growth left. And in particular, in that long range, when I say long range, it's relatively speaking to rimfire.
Mm-hmm.
But I think as people continue to push that envelope, the ammunition's gotten better. I think in many cases, the shooters are improving.
I think matches are more accessible. Families are shooting.
Yes.
So yeah, I think there's definitely,
and I think the one thing that we haven't touched on, but when you see all these other companies that are in that game, competition's the best thing that can happen, because it forces all of us to constantly improve and innovate.
Yep.
Whereas if you're in a market where there might be only one or two players, it's easy to get complacent.
Yeah, and just kind of rest on your product line. And
yes, where this way, and especially with social media out there and all the different things, you can look, like I said, we don't spend a lot of time comparing and seeing how ours stack up, but we're well aware when somebody has developed a new product
mm-hmm.
that has taken it to that next notch.
Yep.
And then it inspires us to, okay, we want to take it even one step further.
Yeah. Where can we go from here?
Where can we go?
Exactly right. I think we did a really good job kind of touching on the parts line. If we missed anything, feel free to email us at podcast.volquartsen.com, and we can definitely touch on it or get back to you. Is there anything you'd like to add, Scott?
No, the one thing I would add, that I would like to add, is something we're trying to do is more and more videos of different parts and how they function and how they install.
Mm-hmm.
So if customers do have questions about a specific part, we enjoy doing those videos, trying to highlight that.
Definitely.
So if they have suggestions or anything along those lines, feel free to reach out. And, like I said earlier in the podcast, we spend a lot of time reading. We may not always get back to people as fast as, we should.
Especially on social media.
When it's an idea or certain things, we try. But we definitely take those to heart every time we see both good and bad.
Yeah, and I can attest to that. More, even on social media, typically probably 3 people for sure see input and feedback that we get on social media or suggestions, especially as far as parts and installs go.
And that, hearing both good and bad is the only way that we can continue to improve as a company.
Yep.
Obviously it's more fun to get the good.
Yeah.
But many times it's the negative, and I don't even want to say negative, but the constructive criticism.
Yeah, we love constructive criticism. We apply
keeps
a lot
pushing
of
us forward.
Yep, completely agree. So yeah, again, if you have any feedback, questions, that's podcast@volquartsen.com. Shoot us an email. Thank you guys for listening.